And I personally am currently sitting on the traditional unceded territory of the Squamish people, known by settlers as Gambier Island. And it was the traditional hunting and fishing grounds of the Squamish or Squamish people. And I'm still working on learning how to say Gambier Island in the Squamish language, which I haven't mastered yet, so I won't even give it a try. I just wanted to say one other thing about reconciliation this morning as it relates to the topic at hand today. And it occurred to me when I was thinking about this morning that the whole system of writing grants and receiving money in the ways that people do as either for studentships or fellowships or whatever it might be is a very colonial structure. And it's often creates interesting challenges when this colonial structure meets the needs of Indigenous people, or tries to meet the need of Indigenous people. And I've been watching that play out in one area of my own remit now. But when the next time you think about it, think about how colonial this structure is, that we have a set of rules, that we follow the rules, we write what we think people want to hear from us, we try to put our ideas down in that very structured and transactional way, and ultimately hope that we get the money. And so I just thought I would reflect a little bit about that. I don't have a good solution for how one might reconcile this whole process. In fact, I'm trying to work on a little bit of that in some other work that I'm doing, trying to soften the edges of a very colonial structured process. But it's very difficult in government, which is a very siloed and colonial institution. So I just thought I'd reflect on that.
Yes.
Okay, so there you go. Greenest city and other related active transport, community projects on a small scale, political science funding, Michael Smith, social determinants and indigenization. So quite a wide variety of things. There you go. And it should start scrolling. There you go. So looks like a good and a wide variety of things. Feel free to continue to put those things in. And I will go back to where we are. So it is my great pleasure today. And I think I'm going to stop the screen share for now. But Dawn, does that give you a reasonable idea of where our participants are coming from?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you, everybody, for helping us. So I have the great pleasure of introducing Dr. Dawn McArthur. I've probably known Dawn longer than anybody in Vancouver, is my guess. What do you think?
My family.
Except your family. Yeah. Well, Dawn and I met at the University of Alberta. She actually was a postdoc of mine. So this is more than 22, 23 years ago. I just got her, I drew her into grant facilitation by getting her to help me with a really huge grant that we ultimately were successful getting. And after that, I'd like to say, Dawn, I taught Dawn everything she knows, but the answer to that is really, it's the other way around. So Dawn taught me a lot about grant writing over the years and has been enormously helpful to me. She serves as you're the director of, I had it up. Where did I go with that title? I hate doing titles. She's the Director of Research and Technology Development at BC Children's Hospitals Research Institute, and has been grant facilitation, doing grant facilitation and giving talks and leading workshops and really leading the field of grant facilitation for more than 15 years now. So you can't have anybody better than Dawn to tell you a little bit about her favorite tips for grant writing, application filling out, that sort of thing. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Dawn. And she's got a deck of, I don't know, about 15 slides, something like that. And then we'll open it for Q&A and some dialogue. So over to you, Dawn.
Thanks, Diane.
Yep, go ahead.
Hi, everybody. I'm joining you from the unceded traditional ancestral territory of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, and it's an absolutely beautiful day to enjoy that land. as Diane said, I'm the Director of Research and Technology Development at the BC Children's BC Children's Hospital Research Institute. That's a hospital-based research institute of UBC and SFU. We have about 10, 12 SFU members. The collaboration's very long-standing, in part because of Diane, in fact. So I was recruited there from SFU 18 years ago. And I didn't think I'd stay there this long, but it's actually quite fun. And interestingly, Newsweek did a, I don't know, some sort of global ranking of children's research hospitals. And Canada has 3 in the top 10, and we are number 6. We're second only to Sick Kids. So we don't, bang the drum very hard for children's, but it's a very good research center. It's kept me entertained for quite a long time, and it's not boring at all. So we've done a lot of different kinds of funding proposals, a lot of different kinds of grants, whether they're community organizations, and they're for everything from subcellular, DNA, genomics, to injury prevention in the communities, to public health, to all kinds of different things. So hopefully in the Q&A, we'll get into some of those different things. When Diane invited me to present with you today, we pulled up something that I actually did for CIHR earlier in the spring. That's my top 10 pieces of advice. So I'm going to share that screen now, and then we'll go to Q&A. Does that sound good? Where's my screen? There's my screen. Slideshows.
And can we make the deck available to people after the fact? Is that okay, Dawn?
Yeah.
Okay, good.
Yeah. So this is where BC Children's is. It's on Oak and 28th. This is our Research Institute building, and the hospital would be just slightly south of there. Nobody has an actual mountain view except for in the hospital, because the community around has a limitation on how tall your building can get. Anyway, so when I talk about grant writing, I hardly ever use the word writing. I use proposal development, because there's a lot of things that happen before writing. And so I use this little cycle. Being someone who worked with Diane for quite a bit, and we have a very similar thinking in the way that we do systems thinking and mapping of things. Anyway, so I use 4 phases. You have to think, map, draft, and refine. So you have to make your plan through thinking and mapping, and then you have to actually craft the proposal through drafting and refining. Now, some people, Diane, do this very quickly. Other people do it very slowly, and it takes a long time. And so it really depends a lot on how your mind works. I myself spend a lot of time in thinking and mapping, and less time in drafting and refining. But some people spend more time in drafting and refining. And it also will depend a lot on your discipline. So for example, if you were a person in social sciences and humanities in Canada, and you were applying to mainstream social sciences and humanities grants, they care a lot more about your background and literature review, which has a lot to do with going from think to draft, and less about your project, which is kind of about mapping your project. So it varies a lot across different things, but it's a nice little framework that works for just sort of thinking about the components of a proposal. The other thing I want to get into briefly, and I think in the Q&A it'll be more fun, is this crafting the proposal is transitioning out of written documents. And I think probably for some of you, you'll be able to do videos. And that does address some of those colonialization issues, because you'll be able to express things in a different way than a written document. But for the moment, most things are text-based, but not everything. So my top 10. First, understand the process. Always applying for money is a balance of you and them. So this is you and your project, and what the scope of your project is, whether it's a research project or a creative project or implementation of something, it doesn't matter. It's what are you doing? And if you're an academic, it matters whether you're doing a project, which is a defined component of something, versus a program, which is more ongoing over time and doesn't have specific start and stop points? And are you applying as an individual or a group? Is it a team approach that they're looking for? Is it a partnered approach? And who are you partnering with? Are they community people, industry people, government people? It really depends a lot. And you have to explain about what skills you're bringing, what experience you're bringing to the table. So you have to think about that. And those aren't the things you learned in school necessarily. They're often the things that come from life. And especially in community engaged research, there's a lot of life that you need to think about here. It's one of the challenges we can talk, my mouse isn't doing the right thing. One of the challenges we can talk about here is how do you describe this expertise if it's a non-mainstream academic, if you're applying for academic funding. But you really need to know a lot about them. Who are you applying to? What are the priorities of that funder? If you're applying for money, then it's important to figure out what they want to spend their money on. If you're applying for access to a resource like a library or a field station or like one of the big like multi-university places like Triumph at UBC or one of those other types of settings, what do they prioritize in bringing people in? And one of the challenges with that is you can be angry as like we get very frustrated with this side of the equation because first of all, the only control you have over here is which applications you choose to apply to. You got all the control on this side of the balance because this is you. You get to do whatever you want over here. But over here, you have almost no control. And it doesn't help really to rail against what they ask for because they are the ones with the power. So, but what's important is to be informed. Do you fit with what they want? Can you make yourself fit with what they want? We can tell some stories about that and be creative about that sometimes, because sometimes they haven't thought about how you actually bring something new to the table. Figure out who your reader and reviewer is. Is your reviewer what we would call in academia a peer? So another academic? Is it a community person, a business person, a government person, a member of the general public, a member of a specific community? Who is it? And we have to speak in that language. I like to say that you're visiting countries and you need to go and actually learn their culture and language. And you have to make choices about this. The other thing that's really, really important is what's the purpose of a grant? Usually it's to get money. And one of the biggest challenges that academics have is that that's not the kind of writing we're used to. So we're used to writing papers, we're used to writing, course outlines or other types of communications, which are descriptive and have the purpose of telling a story. Well, a funding application also tells a story, but it has a very specific purpose. It doesn't live in the world outside of you getting what you want. So it's more like a job application, actually. You have to respond to what they're looking for. And you have to remember that when you're writing it and putting it together. So you have to look at the request for proposals or the request for applications or the, whatever they call it. The instructions, the guidelines, and the review criteria are requests from that funder. Much like a job ad is a request from an employer. And your proposal is a response to that request. So you actually need to target it as close as you can. If you're applying to something like Canada Council, where it's sort of wide open, then they really need to know specific things about you. If you're applying to community engagement like Vancouver Foundation or one of the funding sources that are available from, BC Gaming or any of the other sort of philanthropic sources of funding, you really need to be careful about making sure you align with their needs because they are also accountable to the people who give them money. Make sure you understand the instructions, whatever the instructions are. Remember that when people wrote those instructions, they thought they were being clear, but that doesn't mean they are. So the assumption that the document you're reading to submit the instructions, that they actually are well written and clearly articulated is wrong. They're not. They're usually a group exercise. And sometimes, in some cases, they've gone through so many filters of decision making that they came out worse than they started. So don't make assumptions about it. Don't think it's you. Ask them to explain. The only people who generally, in my experience, don't explain are either really high level government or really big family foundations, because they don't need to. But do get clarity. We do this all the time. And think about before you write. Think about, is it the right time to apply? Or am I just sort of, trying to get money, even though I don't really know what I'm going to do with it? Do you have time to write a grant properly? Despite what they say on TV, like on Grey's Anatomy, where they write an NIH grant in an hour, that is not true. NIH grants can take a year to put together. And so even something that would be from SFU community, you should give it at least a couple weeks, if not a little bit more. And the thinking can take a long time. The putting together of the document might take less time than the thinking. One of the things that people do that is very challenging, especially with big grants and big multi-center or multi sort of team grants, is they try to do the thinking and the writing at the same time. And they try to actually develop the plan while they're writing, rather than having some good, strong meetings of making decisions about what they want to do and then putting it down on paper, computer. And that is really challenging, because once it's written out, we tend to think it's a done deal, and it's really hard to go back and change it. So it's much better, especially if you're trying to develop something that's got a lot of players in it, to actually make that plan well before you start trying to describe it to the funder. Think about as well that, are there alternative funding opportunities? Is there something that is a better fit, or that's at a different timing so that you actually have time? And if you have any unfinished work, or for an academic, any kind of a publication, for a community organization, any kind of an outcome of your programming or something like that, do it first and show that you can finish something. Funders want to see that their funding gets used to completion. Read the review criteria and make a self-assessment. And if there are any weaknesses, if you have awesome strengths, all the better, go forward. If there's any weaknesses, figure out ways to solve them early. Do you need to bring in a different partner? Do you need to bring in a different skill set? Do you need to show something about your organization or yourself? Do a self-assessment. Are you ready? In academia, we will almost always tell people to write papers before they write grants. First of all, grants don't live in the world and papers do. And second of all, the funders, especially the academic ones, mainstream ones, and this is true for scholarships and fellowships as well, they do want to see that you actually have what they would call productivity, so that you've actually done something. So if you're a community organization, and let's say you wanted to put on an event, it's good to be able to say, we had funding for this and we put on this event and this number of people came and we had these kinds of outcomes and that kind of stuff. Or if you produced a tool or some kind of program, you want to be able to show some of the history of your activities and your success. If you're an artist, you'd want to, or a writer, you'd want to show the things that you'd have on your CV and what kinds of shows and presentations and things that you've done. So self-assess yourself early. In mapping, this can be used for creative arts. This little, let's call it an algorithm for lack of a better word. This little flow chart can be used for anything, because even if you're doing creative arts, you're trying to create something from nothing. But you can talk about, what is the problem? Like, what is the gap we're trying to fill? Whether it's a program gap or a knowledge gap or a creativity gap. What are we trying to do? What do we want to create? And the easiest way to think about that is, what do we know? And what don't we know? What do we need to know? What will be a useful is not a very good word, sorry. What will be what we would consider a success in, if we get the money, the issue we're trying to address? And what do we want to find out or create or produce or change? And there's all sorts of steps in this, and it can be from the early stage of partnership development or a community engagement, where you do some sort of scoping about what people want or how they want it to be put together. Or it could be when you've already decided that, and now you actually want to try and do something practical to implement it, or you want to put on a show, or you want to develop a tool or a resource, or any number of different things. Then there's the how are you going to do it? How are we going to try to find this out? What's the method? And this is interestingly where there's actually a lot more flexibility now, not as much in mainstream academia, but in other sources of funding, of being more creative. So, you know, some people are doing TikTok. Some people are doing, you know, drum circles. Some people are doing all kinds of interactive video, and we have so much technology to help us do these in ways that we couldn't do them before. And so it's important here to be both creative and practical at the same time, because if they give you the money or the resource to do it, they actually expect some kind of an outcome. It doesn't mean that everything's going to work all the time. Nobody expects that. But they have to think about your planning of it, and that if all goes well, it will work. What do we need to do it? What are the tools, resources, people, thoughts, skill sets, places, time, spaces, anything? And who are the people who are going to do it? I use 6 building blocks that I've got embedded in here. I've got what and why up here, who and how here, and outcome and impact here. So what, why, who, how, outcome, impact. And that can be used against any funding opportunity of any kind, creative or otherwise. What the solution and the outcome is, what will we find out? What will we create? What will we do? Are we writing a book? Are we giving a talk? Are we writing a play, making music, solving lovely pictures of outer space, like way outer space? And why does it matter? Why does it matter to my local community? Why does it matter to my peer group? Why does it matter to the public at large? Why does it matter to my discipline? Why does it matter? And who needs to know about it? Because the funders will want you to tell people. And if you're doing community-based or any kind of participatory research, then that's an absolute essential to close the circle on this. When you're doing this, it's important to be realistic and pragmatic. You should make sure your rationale is very solid and doesn't have holes in it that some reviewer can say, well, but that doesn't make any sense. Okay. I don't see how that can happen. I don't get it. Build on your strongest data really means build on your strongest track record. If you're young, obviously you have a shorter track record than someone who's older, who's been doing the same thing for a long time. If you're new to it, I guess it doesn't really matter how old you are. If you're new to doing something or newer, but that's okay, because you can transfer skills from other things that you've done. So you want to think about what your transferable skills are to the new thing. Be pragmatic. Do not overpropose. Don't say you're going to solve all the world's problems in like a year for $5,000, because that's not going to happen. Here, I like to usually say, imagine you, because in the pandemic, I'm just doing all of this imaginary travel, that you had, like, you were going to an archipelago and you could visit all the islands, but you can't visit all the islands because you don't have enough money or time to visit all the islands. So which islands are you going to pick? Who are you going to go visit first? It helps one to focus on what's actually realistic in a way that you've done before. We make choices about stuff we do all the time. how much time we have, how much energy we have, how much money we have. All the time. We make these decisions all the time. When people write grants, they tend to go crazy and forget that. So be very pragmatic. Evaluate your assumptions. So if you've assumed that somebody has time or skill set, or that, you don't have any safety nets for issues, then the reviewers will also think of that. So think about those things. You don't have to tell everybody all those things, but usually you can tell in the way that a document is written, whether somebody's thought about things. Like supply chain is sometimes a problem, or, the ferry schedule changes, or weather is bad, or you've assumed that a population will actually want to participate because somebody who is a representative of that group said, oh yeah, they love it. And then it turns out they don't. So just think about that sort of stuff. Confirm availability of necessary resources. If there's something you absolutely need for your project, make sure you have it, unless it's this money or resource, obviously. Other things. And if you need to work with other people and you need to find collaborators or partners or other groups of people to work with or individuals, then think about that and be realistic. Don't pretend you know how to do something you don't actually know how to do, ever, in funding. Find a friend to play with who does know how to do that. There's a few other things to remember, especially if you're doing mainstream academic funding. But even if you're doing community-based funding, some of these things are important. Anything that would be called patient-oriented, community-based, especially with Indigenous peoples, and I'm sure a lot of you have this box is important to you. This has to be done with, not for or of. Always with, always informed by, always directed by, always owned by. And so that is essential, and the trusting relationships have to be built before you can apply for money to do a project. You can apply for money to develop those relationships, though. Equity, diversity, and inclusiveness is like a rapidly moving train that some people have suddenly decided is important, even though many of us knew it was important long ago. And there's a lot of language about this and a lot of different things. So I'm not going to talk about how to embed that, because it depends a lot on what you're doing and the groups you're working with, but it will be important to the funder, and you should follow the funders' guidelines and lead on how they want to address these, remembering that these are three overlapping things, and then they're not the only things in this category of inclusiveness. Sex and gender-based approaches is another challenging thing where both reviewers and applicants are still learning. So sex is obviously not as complex as gender, and how one measures it, how one defines it, how one incorporates it is all going to be very funder and applicant dependent. And if you're working on yeast, for example, it's not as important as if you're working on humans. Data management plans are another thing, because depending on what you're doing, some funders are going to care a lot about where that data goes and how it's stewarded. And it's especially true for community if you're on this axis between these two things or between these two things, because of privacy and ownership, OCAP principles and other sorts of things. They're things that are important to learn about if they're relevant to you. So you've made a plan, now you're going to make a draft. Whether your draft is a text-based or video-based or whatever it is, it should be a mess for your first draft. Now, Diane doesn't do this, but everybody else I've ever met in my entire life does. Diane is my one example of someone who never does a messy first draft. Don't harass yourself on your first draft. Be kind to yourself on your first draft and just get it out of your head. So it will be incomplete, disorganized, and probably longer, possibly shorter than the final version needs to be. Don't worry about any of those things. You're not submitting your first draft unless you're Diane, and She usually does too. Okay. You're not submitting it. You're getting it out of your head. So you can try a variety of different things, especially if you're not that comfortable with words, or you're writing in a language that's not your sort of daily language or your most comfortable language. Try using slides. I mean, sometimes I'm a big picture drawer, so I draw pictures of pretty much everything. So you can try making slides and saying, I'm going to give a presentation about this. What would I talk about? What are the most important points that I want to talk about? You can storyboard. You can use Post-it notes and move them around. We do that sometimes with big proposals all the time. We do like big flow diagram, messy things on whiteboards. Try voice to text, or even just recording yourself talking about it. One of the people I work with does that all the time while he's running. He'll actually record himself talking about his research plans while he's running, because that's when he's thinking about it. And so if he talks about it while he's thinking about it, then he catches those ideas. He doesn't have to wait till he, gets home and tries to remember what he was thinking. So there's a lot of different ways. Most of us are going to sit down in front of a computer, though. And computers are a challenge because we edit at the same time as we write. We read and write at the same time, two different parts of your brain. Do not edit as you write on your first draft. I recommend people turn off their screens or put a paper over their screens or close their eyes, because that's actually quite funny. But don't edit yourself. Get it out of your head. Don't fret about grammar. Don't try to write everything you know. Just try to get your thoughts out in whatever way works. Then you're going to sort them as you refine it. Also, if you want to use graphics, it's especially fun if you're doing, whether it's a written proposal or not, but it's good fun if you're doing slide decks. For Grand Challenges Canada, for example, they gave us a choice once between a 30-page proposal or 12 slides. Oh, we're picking 12 slides for sure. And so you need graphics for slides. And think about how you can develop graphics. You don't need to be a graphic designer. You don't need to be an expert at this for a funding application in almost all cases. But for you, you can use it as a framework for your talking so that people can refer to it. This is why textbooks and Scientific American and stuff have pictures. So you can look at the picture and go, oh yeah, that's what they mean. You can show your context with all kinds of things. We use maps and all kinds of things in our grants. You can give details that you wouldn't otherwise be able to give, especially if there's data, if you have data of some sort. And it does save space. They are worth, 1,000 words. For the reviewers, it does improve readability. We will remember a picture long before we'll remember words. It can reduce the complexity. If it's a good graphic, it can make it worse if it's not a good graphic, but it can reduce complexity because you can cluster things into bigger chunks. It improves understanding because it shows relationships among things and flow and all kinds of different things. It does enhance retention and recall because we do remember the pictures, and it prompts further thinking because it will remind them of context. Once you've done your first draft, your big, messy, ugly first draft, you want to start reviewing and you want to refine. And this is written here in a reviewing in layers. But I have to say that for those of us who do this all the time, every day, we don't do this as linearly as this, but you really want to start with your plan, because that's what the reviewers are really looking at. I mean, they're going to look at the words and the font and all kinds of stuff like that, because that's the visual, but what they're really assessing is what you're talking about. What is your plan? What are you going to do with the money or resource you're asking for? What is my content in my proposal? Have I actually described my plan clearly? Yesterday, I was reviewing something where they're doing 3 serial samples of something, and they didn't just call them sample A, B, and C or sample 1, 2, and 3. They kept referring to dates and things, and it got very confusing. It's like, just call them sample 1, 2, 3 and make it easy for the reviewer to figure that out. Language and flow and alignment with review criteria are very much the copy editing. This is more substantive editing up here, and this is more copy editing and looking at the presentation of your argument, because a funding application is a persuasive document that you have to address the request. So you want to go back at the end and double check that you've actually done that. Hold it up to the mirror of the review criteria and the mandate of your funder. So when you're doing the first draft and stuff, you're just setting out on your own path. And when you're refining it, you want to make sure you bring that path right back to where they want you to get to. And ask your colleagues and friends to review and critique. One of the things we will often do, especially on an early draft, is we do something I call key points exercise, where we ask 3 readers to take a highlighter, either digitally or on paper, and highlight the things they think are most important in the document. And they read quickly. So they're skimming and they highlight. And if 3 people see the same things, then you can make a pretty good assumption that most readers will see them. On an early draft, that won't happen. People will see all sorts of different things. But if you can get at least 2 other people to read it and see that they're seeing the same things, or they can tell you back what you're trying to do, then the odds are pretty good that any reader will see it and that you're making your point relatively clearly. The other thing that exercise does, which is not really the topic of today, but what it does is it shows you that if you put a key point in the middle of a paragraph, because a key point should never be in the middle of a paragraph. It should always be at the beginning or the end of a paragraph. It should be in the topic sentence or the summary sentence, not the stuff in the middle. The other thing is we don't read in the middle. We never read in the middle. Our eyes skip stuff in the middle all the time. So you don't want that there. You want to make sure that reviewers are going to see the stuff. So you want it at the top, the bottom, the front, the end, never in the middle. Remember, the reviewer is a reader, not a writer. That's part of the reason I don't generally use grant writing. The decision maker is a reader. So we want to keep it simple, clear, and positive. And have the concept of one goal in a proposal, one concept in a paragraph, and one point in a sentence. This is not Dickensian literature that you're writing when you're applying for funding. It's a grant. It needs to be straightforward, clear, practical. The reviewer needs to be able to get to the point and why you want to do it as fast as possible. They want to be able to say what your goal is, because sometimes they have to defend it against a different proposal in the selection process. So they need to be able to do that. Try reading your text in a variety of ways. I know that most of us don't like to read on paper anymore, but it's not a bad idea. Some people do print things to read them. It's also important to remember that most of your reviewers are going to have vision issues because they're probably over 30, and some people write on paper. Digital, I sometimes read on my phone, and try it out loud. One of my group reads out loud all the time to see where sentences are problematic. These are things that, especially the out loud, if it's complex thought and you're trying to layer it out, sometimes reading out loud helps you figure out how to say it in a more direct way. Just to finalize this, one of the things about proposals that work for funding, they're not really about what you want to say. They're not about writing or language or problems or description, even though that's you. They're about what they want to know. They're about reading. They're about research or creatively or project development, whatever it is. They're about solutions. They're about creating something new, whether that's a relationship or a tool or a program, whatever. And they are about persuasion, because you have to get, much like a job application, you have to get the person who's reading it to pick you. So I'm just going to end there and say good luck, get funding. And I'm going to stop the share.
Thank you, Dawn. Love it. That was great. So welcome you to come back, and if you want, put on your video screens and we'll have a bit of a Q&A. So let's use the hand raise function if you've got a question. There was one in the, there were a couple in the chat actually. Tatiana was asking about how long do you think it would take the average student to write their first application? And I suppose my answer to that question is, it's hard to say because it really depends on the person. That's how I would respond to that. What do you think, Dawn? Do you have some, have you worked with students much in writing applications?
Oh yeah, we do it all the time.
Yeah.
So if you're applying, let's say you're applying for a summer studentship, You're always working with whoever the supervisor is going to be, and that's going to probably take a month to put together just because of time. If you're working on a graduate scholarship or fellowship, I would give it at least 3 months to develop it. And that's not every day. That's just how long it takes to put those together. If you're a student applying for funding to put on a show or develop something or do some sort of activity, it really depends on what they're asking for. Because if they just want like a 2-page summary of what you're going to do, that might not take that long to actually write. But it probably takes a while to meet with the other people and talk about it. So the mapping and planning part actually can take a lot longer than the writing part.
Yeah.
So,
I know when I started writing grants, it took me a long time, and because you have to kind of also learn your own process, the things that are easy for you, the things that are hard for you. One of the things I learned through that process of repeatedly applying was I usually knew what was wrong in the document that I had prepared, but until I asked somebody to read it and they told me, I didn't want to face it. Like I just thought, okay, I see it, I know it's wrong, but I'm not sure that I can face fixing that. I've got 24 hours left before I got to start copying this thing. What am I going to do? But by having somebody else tell me, it kind of, oh shit, I guess I really do have to fix that because somebody else is going to see it. So I learned also what cues for me were important. And I think that is something that you'll learn if you do this more than once, and if you do it on a repeated basis.
Yeah. I mean, some people, I think you can think about other types of writing you've had to do, and other types of, like a lot of the time in academia, you're like reading a bunch of stuff and then summarizing it, which is kind of like a literature review. But maybe if you did any kind of lab work and you had to write up your lab results, it's a little bit more like that. How hard was that? So for some people it's easy, and for some people it's hard, and you have to learn how your brain works. Some people are good talkers, and I seriously mean just talk it out first.
So there's some other questions in the chat, but I would welcome people to speak their questions as well. And maybe I'll call on Khan to open his mic and offer up which of your questions that you've asked you'd like to put to Dawn or to me. Can I pick on you?
So this is to the collective wisdom in the room. In my background from film and television, I see a lot of parallels. In that world, there used to be something called the guide that the Canadian Film and Television Producers Association put out. Quebec, SODEC has something similar. In BC, how does one survey the landscape? Who are the players? What does for lack of a better context appropriate term, what does the marketplace look like? Who are the donors? How much funds do they have? What are their mission statements? What are the gaps that they're trying to address, etc.?
Dawn?
Well,
some thoughts about that?
That's something I would start with Google. So, and I would start with the professional organizations and things like Emily Carr, places, or Vancouver Film School or somewhere, because they usually will have, even CIAT, I think at SFU has a funding list. And so you can start there, and then it's a bit like ripples on a pond, where you can start going out and do this sort of investigation towards what different funders are. There's going to be some that rise to the top for sure because they're bigger or have more money, and then there'll be smaller ones that are a little bit more niche and might be about specific topics, or they might have a priority at a given time. But if I were looking for funding for that, I would start with that. I would start with the film schools, the academic settings, and then the community organizations and professional organizations. The government of Canada does have, if you're looking for federal, like for documentaries in particular, something called the Canadian Subsidy Directory, which is all federal department funding. So Heritage Canada, Environment Canada, Fisher, DF, any government funder. And the other place that's kind of an interesting place to look for that stuff is provincial and federal industry.
Yeah, I don't think there are, well,
don't
in my experience, there aren't sector-based catalogs necessarily. So I think it's unique to each individual situation. You may come across one by talking to people, but probably finding, in a particular sector, yeah, maybe some sectors do have them, but many might not. And it might not be attuned to the specific domain that you're interested in. Like
Exactly.
Don mentioned documentaries, but on the other hand, I saw you shake your head under those circumstances. So it's going to depend a lot, I think, on the specifics of what you're looking for. So
Yeah, and the other thing is that, well, to be very blunt, if somebody creates a catalog, that's the things they know. If you
yeah,
go find your own things, like you'll find the ones that rise to the top, but you might find other ones that other people are not really paying that much attention to.
yeah,
And that kind of gives you a leg up in those domains.
yeah. Big fish in the small pond is a useful strategy under the circumstances,
It is, and
actually.
also, like if somebody puts out funding and they don't advertise it, like we use social media to pay attention to these things all the time, because a lot of funders will post an opportunity on social media, but they don't post it anywhere else.
And you
Or
can go to resources like Dawn to ask the question at other times. Alice, I saw your hand up.
Yeah, it looks like a great time to segue into Pablo's question here, which is how do
Yeah.
you organize grants and deadlines to make sure you apply on time? Do you use a spreadsheet, task manager, et cetera? And what tools do you use for grant research?
Well, in the office, if we were working in the office, we have lists on our whiteboards, because I have no short-term memory whatsoever, and I need it visually in front of me or I won't remember it. Since we've been working from home, we use a Google spreadsheet, and we just keep upcoming, keep an eye on things and keep it upcoming. When I started doing this kind of work, I spent about maybe an hour a week doing what Con was talking about, is looking for funding opportunities and different things and mapping out what a year looks like. But on the backdrop of that year of things that are continuous annual things, there's always new things. And so we also pay a lot of attention to priorities of governments and different sectors to see whether or not suddenly there's funding available in those things. So I still dedicate probably about an hour a week to just checking what's going on. And usually I will either write things down in front of me because I have no memory, or I use calendars and electronic ones, paper ones, Google Docs, whiteboards, whatever.
I use an electronic whiteboard. I use Mural so much now, both for sort of plotting things, data analysis, sense making, if I can put it that way, of really messy data. Con knows I use it for teaching, to lay out a course. I find it enormously helpful. It's one of the positives in my mind of the pandemic, is I came to find electronic whiteboards as enormously useful and expandable, etc. But the other thing is, when I was a new grant applicant, I would do lots of that kind of work where I would try to pace myself and figure out how long it takes to do each of these phases and plot it out with a project management kind of plan. And then as I got older and more practiced, I knew I would get anxious if I was running late. And so, I just had that personal internal clock that said, uh-oh, I've got only 3 more weeks and I've got to do X, Y, and Z. And so I didn't actually at that time have to write it down. Now I'm probably back to having to write it down like Dawn, because my short-term memory's disappearing as I age. But, again, a lot of this is about knowing yourself or learning about yourself through the process. And, there's an interesting question about, if you're not ready, should you apply anyways to take yourself through the process, or is there a downside to that? So I'll pose that question to you, Dawn. What do you think about that notion that, oh, well, I'm not really ready, but if I do it, then I'll get some feedback and I might do better next time? What's your response to that?
Well, I think that going through the first two, the thinking and planning part, then making the plan, is an ongoing activity that's always time well spent. Applying, if you don't think you have at least, in my opinion, if you don't think you have at least a 50-50 chance of getting it, I don't think it's worth submitting. Because first of all, there's a lot of pressure on the reviewers to do a good job, and they get frustrated, and they have memories. They will remember people's names and projects and things. We don't want to waste their time. If you need to get feedback from somebody outside of that funder. Get feedback from someone like me or Diane or a colleague. I don't subscribe to the practice of trying to get the grant funder reviewers comments, because that makes it sound like they're the ones who have the best feedback for you. And they don't necessarily. They have decision-making feedback during a competition for sure. But I have read thousands of reviews, and some of them are pretty bad. So I don't really subscribe, even in academia, to throwing as much as you can against the wall and hoping something sticks. I would get feedback from the people around me who are involved in the research or who are not involved with the research, like an arm's length view. Buy your friends some coffee and get some perspectives from them before you submit to an actual competition.
The other thing is get perspectives from more than one person.
Yeah.
And, you know, Dawn will recall my experience when I was writing my first grant in an area that I didn't really know a lot about, type 1 diabetes. And I asked the expert in my institution to give me feedback, and he handed it to me and he said, "Oh, that's really nice." And I just thought, well, I won't say that language here. F you was my response to that. And then I asked somebody who was not an expert in the field, who was actually my boss, who was the head of my department. And he was an expert in a totally different field. And yet he gave me fabulous feedback because he read it like a reader. And like in many Canadian institutions, you don't necessarily have experts around the table. You have general experts. You have people who understand what a grant should look like, but they might not be an expert in the intimate detail of the esoteric area that you're working in. And while that's a big problem in science, that sort of balance of expertise, it may be different under other circumstances. But what I found through trial and error is the people who would give me the feedback I needed to be successful. And so sometimes you need to do that as well. Don't just depend on one person, and you might get conflicting advice, right? You might have people tell you the opposite. And so by hearing it from 2 or 3 or 4 people, you begin to understand what might be taken in different ways, what different people will think about it, and then you can find your best path through that with the resources and capacities that you have.
Yeah. The other thing I would add to that is something I learned before the pandemic, but has been really emphasized by the pandemic, is when people review electronically, like on digital review with comments in Word documents and things like that, we tend to be very negative. We'll only point out things we think are flaws that need to be corrected. We will critique in a bad way. We will not show the positive side of the coin. And so it's really, really important when someone else, if you guys review each other or something like that, to say what you like and what you think could be strengthened, what's good and what needs to work. You're not marking it, you're helping it get better. And so that's really important. The other thing that happens, and this happens much like what in Diane's thing, is that electronically people will copy edit your language. They won't read the content and give you feedback on the content. They will do stylistic edits on your language, and they'll think
both are important.
They are, but not if you're asking for content.
Yeah, absolutely. So
if you really want a review of content, tell them to stop looking at language and read the content. But key points does work. That key points exercise does work for that to a certain degree.
So I wish we could keep going, because I think there could be a continuing vigorous conversation here, but it is 11:59, and so we're on the hour, and I want to respect people's time. I hope everybody got something of value out of today's event. Thank you, Dawn, for stepping in. I agreed to do this and then realized I wasn't the best person for the job, so I invited Dawn to do this, and really, really appreciate your expertise over the years, your review of my grants, and you're helping some of our alum here in the Center for Dialogue think about next steps for the work that they're doing. So thanks a lot, Dawn. Really appreciate it. Thanks, Jocelyn and Alice, for setting this up, and for all of you for attending. And nice to see some of my old students and friends in the pictures. So have a great rest of your week, everyone.